In this chapter, the social world, we will see that humans are intensely social, as monkeys and apes, what made us survive through years. So in this chapter, we will talk about how our origins were to understand our social behavior in present. We are studying primate societies, so we have to know that societies were reduced along history, spread over large areas. First permanent settlements appeared around 10,000 years ago. Being part of a society implicitly meant taking your interests apart sometimes in order to solve group problems in the long run. This implicit contract used to be established in order to reduce predation risk. In the process of learning to live in larger areas, they had to establish exchange networks that guarantees the comfort of everyone. Hunter-gatherer societies were organized in camps of 25 to 50 of people, and communities of 100 to 200 of people to share rights and benefits of the territory. Societies of thousands of people appeared around 7,000 years ago. It has been discovered that there's a relation between neocortex and social behavior, and from that way, there's a theory proposed called social brain hypothesis. The relation that neocortex and social behavior hold lies in the fact that actions related to interact with other people are controlled by neocortex, to be specific, frontal parts in the frontal lobe. There are studies that affirm that 150 were the individuals in hunter-gatherer communities, but also in post-industrial societies, what means that we are still influenced by this relation, as social brain hypothesis holds. It has been also studied that monkeys and apes lie in separate lines, what it means that something peculiar happened during the evolutionary history. Studies also suggest that apes have to use more computing power to maintain a group of a given size, because of the complexity of the relationships. Apes work with virtual and physical individuals, monkeys don't. So, what we can conclude is that apes need much more computing power. That cognitive constraint is due to natural selection, and dispersed society could be critical for our nomadic lifestyle, because at that time it reduced predation risk. And now our ability enables us to conceive mental entities that have no real-world manifestation. Beliefs and desires motivation can be more powerful than solid real-world objects. What permits people to establish solid bonds to hold people together across space and time. All that we have talked about leads us to circles of intimacy. Grouping around 100 people is a feature of human social network, but that network is structured in hierarchically subgrouping. First subgroup is the 5-people group, in which you seek for emotional support, increases time, and all the stuff. The following one is composed by people that you have a particular close relationship. The following one is composed by people in which you are interested enough, and is a typical size of hunter-gatherer camps. The following one is composed by people that you know personally, that you know them as individuals, and is the typical size of a hunter-gatherer clans. The following group is recognized as megaband and is composed of 500 people. And the last one is composed by 1,500 of people, and this is called the tribe. It's just people who speak the same language or dialect. Who lies out of 150 groups are known them as categories of individuals, like policemen and librarians. And adding someone to inner circles means dropping out someone else, and intimacy is truly related to frequency of contact. If you lose touch with someone, you have to start again from scratch. We can't talk about societies without talking about trust and reciprocity. Knowledge have important implications in relationships because how we know people creates a sense of trust and obligation that smooths the process of interaction. By trust and obligation, a society just could carry on if the number of population do not exceed 150. Otherwise, you would need a police force for taking care of people. And going back to hunter-gatherer primal societies, an, exper an experiment showed that we would ask for a favor around 100 people, the typical size of a hunter-gatherer society. So, trust becomes important in society because you can check everyone you know's honesty and reliability. So, we have to do it, to trust in them, by the implicit social contract of societies. But that trust breaks down during troubled times. Now, talking about trust and reciprocity, it's a good moment to talk about Deacon's paradox. Deacon's paradox consists in the existence of people that try to take advantage from the implicit social contract without paying all the costs. That people are called free riders. For example, they take more than they need at the expense of population interests. The action of free riders, as it is said in the beginning, is the cause of the breakdown of societies, because they propitiate the lack of trust and the breakdown of implicit social contracts.
Chapter 8: Language and Culture. When we try to explain what differentiates us from animals, we can state that the difference is the use of language and culture. These features, even if looking completely apart, are related to each other. Language is part of our culture, and culture depends on language. This division between humans and other species has been a subject of debate. Ethologists defend that neither culture nor language are present only in human beings. In response, social scientists claim some characteristics that make our language incomparable with the communication of any other species. These characteristics are the arbitrariness of the signal meaning relationship, an existent grammar as a code for information, and the graduation of our sounds, without changing the meaning of the message at all. Even though some animals may seem to present some of these features, any of them achieve a communication as complex as human communication. Speaking of culture, there are different points of view. Social anthropologists understand culture as those aspects of behavior learned from other society members. They see different culture phenomena, like the rules for behavior, the artifacts that we use, and the literature, music, or art. Ethologists think of culture as the behavior itself. The weight of the different cultures remains in the difference in behavior, while psychologists focus on the mechanisms for learning this culture, when individuals imitate another member's behaviors. Nowadays, it is thought that language evolved for social purposes. The most important of all is for social bondings, related to the gossip hypothesis. Apes use grooming in order to strengthen the trust among the group. They use about 20% of the time of each day to social interactions, just like humans. But humans live in larger groups of about 150 people. Language facilitates this social interaction between larger groups. which should spend more time in grooming, and social bondings are needed for them to exist. Thanks to this grooming hypothesis, we can date when did groups outnumber the ideal size for spending the 20% of time per day dedicated to social interactions. Along some anatomical evidence, such as the diameter of the tongue's nerve, we can state that the capacity to speak goes to 500,000 years ago, and our grammatical capacity goes to 200,000 years ago, when the key mutations appear in humans. Culture is also approached as a mechanism of inheritance. In order to study this, we coined the term MIMI as a unit of culture, speaking of phenomenological units of transmission. This term was made out based on Darwin's idea of genes. Despite culture can be seen as a unitary phenomenon, we can isolate components and analyze its behavior. For example, changes in pottery patterns because of the utility or just because of fashion. However, biological inheritance is quite different from cultural inheritance. Cultural traits can be inherited between peers instead of the parents to offspring transmission typical of genes and DNA. Furthermore, cultural inheritance can occur immediately as its transmission mechanism is learning. On the other hand, intentionality is really important in our language and culture. Listeners do as much as the speaker thanks to our mind reading capacity, discussing theory of mind that allow us to understand others' point of view and different meanings for same words used in metaphors, sarcasm or jokes. With this, we confirm again that language is crucial to culture, as it is essential for the generation of institutional facts, those agreements between members of a society, such as marriage, the money value, or the government. This is due to our frontal lobe's volume, that, even though it is really similar in apes, they only achieve a second level intentionality. This is a clear evidence that language and culture points out the differences between humans and other species, as only humans are able to achieve these levels of intentionality.
Chapter 9: The Uniqueness of Human Being. Process of cultural evolution. Processes by which cultural changes occur and how it is linked to biological evolution. Essentially, three kinds of models, each of which postulate a slightly different relationship between genes and culture. Number one, culture on a leash. A trait that proves to have heavily adverse effect on individual fitness will die out. However, separating learned behaviors, culture, from genetically inherited traits doesn't really make sense if culturally learned behaviors are inherited like biological traits have the same fitness effects, then they are biological traits. Number two, semi-independent traits. Genetic and cultural traits are semi-independent. This model aims to discover the conditions under which both fitness will be maximized. Interaction of cultural practices with heritable biological traits can lead to significant evolutionary change. Number three, completely independent traits, known as dual inheritance theory. Genes and culture as separate forms of inheritance, which may or may not interact with each other. Seen as most promising form because it can help explain why we might engage in behaviors that have adverse effects on our fitness. One thing we need to be aware about is something may appear to be purely biological trait, when in fact it requires a large cultural input for its expression, such as diet, for example. Dual inheritance theory has placed a lot of emphasis on the specific mechanisms by which cultural traits are passed on and learned, because this determines the degree to which genes and culture will interact and co-evolve. Conformity bias and cultural change. People often feel their behavior is dictated by by culture because humans show a strong conformity bias, tending in a given situation to act like others would. Experiments from the 60s have shown the need to conform can be so strong that people would willing to die rather than stand out from the crowd. However, conformity bias can be a powerful way of learning adaptive strategies in information-poor environments. Moral behaviors to live in a society are usually inculcated in us as children, and we are often prepared to follow them for the rest of our lives. However, we can easily pick up those of the other cultures, in the main by doing what we see others do. However, changes because the conformity bias must interact with individual learning, and individuals need to be sensitive to environmental change. Some individuals are less likely to conform than others, allowing them to respond adaptively, bringing new behaviors that spread through the population. And once the behavior becomes widespread, conformity bias. Evolution with functional consequences. One of the most cleanest examples of gene culture coevolutions is lactose tolerance among cattle keeping human populations. While babies are all born with the ability to digest milk, it is lost in most humans shortly after weaning. The only exceptions are Europeans and people from northern parts of Africa, which have retained the ability to digest lactose. It seems the common ancestor of these populations acquired a mutation in the gene responsible for producing lactase. Instead of switching off the gene, it kept on going into adulthood. Anthropologist William Durham argues it was reinforced by a behavioral adaptation to ingest milk due to nutritional deficit and by a cultural disposition to eat dairy products. If populations have not been forced to turn milk for food, the lactase mutation may have been lost. Under these conditions, individuals with the lactase mutation had higher fitness than those without. Behavior was essential for the mutation to prevail. Cultural evolution under neutral selection. Elements of culture, known as memes, can be highly successful in terms of their spread through societies, but they not necessarily have any bearing on the fitness of the individuals that carry them, since they spread horizontally rather than vertically. Fashions and clothings can probably be seen in this light. Why certain crazes hit only certain sections of the populations and not others is explained to horizontal transmissions. When memes actually do go bad. Robert Auger provides us with what is probably the only fully analyzed case in which we can be absolutely sure that we have an instance of cultural evolution independent of conventional natural selection at the genetic level. It involves food avoidance practices among people that live in the Ituri forest, which have resulted in a shortfall of about 1% in animal nutritional intake. Two individual women cases from the sample have lost around 5% in lifetime fertility. In this tribe, virilocality is practiced, which means when they get married, women leave their birth homes, usually at an early age, finding themselves in an alien environment and sticking to their childhood practices, despite they may no longer be relevant. Under appropriate conditions, meme can drive genes to extinction. An example is given by Vikings in the southern tip of Greenland in 1408. The colony died out due to starvation as the Little Ice Age set in. It seems that Greenland Vikings were unable to let go of their Scandinavian farming practices and adopt more successful hunting lifestyle of the Inuit. Vikings seem to have dismissed the pagan Inuit and their culture as beneath the consideration of a devotedly Christian society. The rejection towards Inuit practices on this idiosyncratic grounds meant the Vikings couldn't benefit from copying them, even knowing their practices were successful.